Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Helen.
And this is the Squiggly Careers podcast. Every week we talk about a topic to do with work, and we hope to share some ideas, actions and tools to help all of us navigate our squiggly careers with a bit more confidence, clarity and control.
And because we know that lots of people might listen on the go, whatever that looks like for you, I hear lots of feedback from people who listen to podcasts while walking their dogs. And it's not always the opportune moment to think about or write down or take action with your careers. Because of that feedback, we create pod sheets. So these are sort of one-page summaries that after you've listened, you can download and hopefully makes it a bit easier to apply some of the things we've talked about. So all the resources we create from pod sheets, pod mail, pod plus, you can get all of that on our website, which is just amazingif.com.
And so this week we're talking about how to be an intrapreneur. So we'll start straight away with what that is, I think, just so that we're all talking about the same thing, because it's not an everyday word. And I think as we get into the description, it becomes clear how it's relevant for all of us and why we think it matters in a squiggly career. And then we're going to go on and talk about some easy actions, and this week also some harder actions about what it might take to be an intrapreneur in your organisation. So Helen, do you want to start us off with what it is?
So yeah, let's start with the definition. So an intrapreneur is somebody who acts like an entrepreneur, but inside a company. And what that means that they are doing is they are cutting through complexity and a lot of the noise and bureaucracy that we might get in big businesses. And they are able to present people with new ideas and projects that help the business grow. That's quite a kind of short definition, but there's quite a lot in there. So there's lots of abilities in there, their ability to cut through. So they have that kind of pace and agility. They have new ideas. So they're seeing opportunities that maybe other people don't. And these aren't sort of coming from a selfish place. So it's not because I want to do this. This is sort of in service of the organisation. So that's really what it means when we're looking at intrapreneurship. The difference, obviously, is an entrepreneur. That's somebody who kind of does it for themselves. They run their own company, maybe a bit like what Sarah and I do now, though I actually feel a bit uncomfortable with the label entrepreneur. I've never really identified with it. And I know that lots of people like the idea of running their own company, but don't really want to take that risk for a whole load of reasons, really. It might not be right for them. They might not feel like they have the idea. It's sort of a sort of nice idea in theory, but the reality might be a bit different. So this is why we think that intrapreneurship as a skill and an opportunity for people in organizations actually has an awful lot more appeal, because not everyone is going to do their own thing and run their own company, and that's absolutely fine. But lots more people can operate like an intrapreneur within an organisation, and that's what we really want to focus on in terms of how we can help people today.
And I think it's worth saying, as we've been reflecting on this, I think this is a hard thing to do. In lots of ways, I think it's easier to be an entrepreneur. Like Helen and I can directly contrast our experiences in really big organisations and what we do now. And some of the stuff that makes this hard in a company doesn't exist when you're starting from scratch. You know, there aren't the systems, you don't have to cut through, you don't have to engage with loads of people. In lots of ways, you can get stuff off the ground in your own way, particularly I think when you're starting from scratch. And so I don't think this is an easy thing to do well. And I think that's why there's quite a lot of articles and things that you can read about this skill, because I think organisations recognise just how valuable it is when someone can do this. And there's a lovely quote I found from somebody called, great name, Gifford Pinchot, back from 1984, so old school. But I really like the definition. He describes intrapreneurs as dreamers who do, those who take hands-on responsibility for creating innovation of any kind within a business.
I like that, dreamers who do.
Yeah.
I feel like that's like a really nice mix of these abilities, because I think entrepreneurs can see what could be better, and that's the dreaming, but then they ultimately take action. One thing I would say is I was a presentation recently where a head of innovation technology of a large company was presenting, and I was learning a lot by watching, and they talked about a book, The A to Z Intrapreneurship, which is actually, I've flicked through it since, and it's really good, but I think it is still a little bit intimidating. So some of the examples for in there are like the invention of the Post-it note. So one of the person is
and it's always Steve Jobs. Why is it always Steve Jobs? Yeah. Oh yeah, they just invented like the Mac, and you're like, all right.
Like, this person accidentally realised that paper stuck, and as a result, the Post-it note, the ubiquitous communication tool for everybody, was invented. I'm like, oh, is that the scale we're going for? We all try to invent the Post-it note. But I think, like, the dreamers who do, I actually think is probably more the level that we're operating at in this podcast. Like, what do you think could be better, and how do you make it happen? Is I think the essence of intrapreneurship that we're trying to connect with.
And why we think it matters in your squiggly career. So why should we care about this as a topic? Well, what you do see is that when people feel like they have the autonomy and freedom, when they can be an intrapreneur, those people are really motivated. So they feel like they are making progress, they've got great profile, just their kind of return on effort and energy is really high. So, when you kind of think about, have I had a positive impact in the work that I do? Does my work feel purposeful? When you read about intrapreneurs, when people sort of have got examples of having done that in their organisations, which are not Post-it notes and inventing the Mac, those people feel really good. They feel really good about kind of the time they spend at work, because often there's a bit of job crafting that's happening, so people feel like they've got kind of personal responsibility for their role. And also you are definitely learning by doing, because I do think with intrapreneurs there's a lot of emphasis on, this is not about having ideas. And I think that's a mistake or a myth that you might have about this. It's like, oh, I need to be generating loads of ideas. And sometimes we perhaps again label ourselves as, oh, but I'm not an ideas person, or I'm not a creative person. Actually, what you see is most organisations don't need people like me. So you don't need people who just have lots and lots of ideas. Like, I've always got an idea. So organisations don't need more ideas. What they need is more people who can sometimes have the ideas, but really execute and take action around those ideas, and do that, with pace. And as Helen described, like, cut through the complexity, like find a way of making these things happen, sort of despite the organisation, or in spite of the organisation, perhaps.
I was just thinking about a bit of a scale, which you may or not agree with, but as you were talking there, I was like, at one end you've got an ideator, right? So kind of, I feel like this is not the only thing that you can do, but it's a natural home for you, is that you are an ideator. You can always see better. You kind of have like this endless ability to kind of be like, oh, but what if? And that's part of your skill. And then you have, like, maybe at the other end you have the innovator, so the kind of career professional who maybe like works in an innovation team. This is kind of, this is what they do for their job. They are the identified innovator in an organization. And I feel like what we are maybe talking about is this sort of intrapreneurial ability that maybe sits between the two. So it doesn't have to be your job title. Like, it's not Helen Tupper, the intrapreneur in Amazing If, or whatever. It's an ability that helps you maybe take other people's ideas, for example, and move them forward, connect people to them, give them some energy and momentum. But this doesn't have to be your job title in order for you to be able to demonstrate this ability at work. I feel like this is the bit maybe in the middle that more people could do.
Yeah, the middle ground for the majority, I think we're describing.
Yeah. Nice. We want that.
We do. And there is a good HBR article that we will link to in the pod sheet on why you should become an intrapreneur. So if you did want to read more examples and a bit more of a description, dive in a bit deeper, I've had a read of that before today, and I just found it a kind of a really useful and kind of well-researched summary. So if we think now about what skills does an intrapreneur have, so what is it that they are doing well? Well, in that article, one of the things that they do say very early on is that it's important to recognise that there is not a single profile. So in lots of ways, again, that should feel reassuring, because this is not I must be able to do these 4 things to an excellent standard, otherwise I can't be an intrapreneur. I think some of these traits we're going to talk about, all of us will have at least 1 or 2 of these things that we already do well, and probably 1 or 2 work-ons. So what do you do well? What are your kind of work-ons? And it's about bringing these things together if this is something important to you, if you kind of want to do more of these things. And so some of the common traits that we see, the first one, which is sort of universally true, I think, is this ability to be proactive and take initiative. So you are sort of creating this action, creating change. You aren't necessarily waiting to be told what to do, and you're not sort of expecting almost someone to sort of give you this opportunity to be an intrapreneur. It's like you're sort of seeking it, you're just always sort of scanning and spotting. And so we'll talk a bit more about that. But I think that's definitely a trait that you see, is this sort of this proactive nature. Secondly, I think you've got to be happy to challenge the status quo. So intrapreneurs are essentially changing things, or maybe championing new things some of the time. And so these are restless people who don't accept how things are today, and they are really motivated by making things better, and as Helen said, for the good of the organisation. So they're not motivated by themselves and necessarily like making themselves look good, but they do have a really strong belief that this is the right thing to do. There's definitely a kind of a sense there of like, I believe in this. Third, influence. To make these things happen, intrapreneurs are very good at recognising I need the right sponsors and supporters. Who are the right people to have around me? And this is not about convening big meetings or big cross-functional steering groups. This is like quickly, who are the people I need to get in front of? Who are the people that I need maybe just enough support from to move things forward? And then the last one, which always makes me feel a bit uncomfortable, and I think this is the one that I would find the hardest, and did find the hardest in big companies, was this idea of acting first. So seeking forgiveness, not permission. And I had a boss who, like, that was basically her mantra. She was like, yeah, don't worry about it, Sarah, like, seek forgiveness, not permission. And, was somebody who I think really at her heart, I'm like, I do quite like to follow the rules. There's like a reason I worked in big companies and structures and systems. And this idea of like, just do it and it'll probably be fine. And I think my critical thinking was like, will it though? And like, what happens? And because I can see scenarios, I was like, well, what happens if it isn't? And so I think there's a lot in that, but definitely of the four, that one just makes me feel tense and a bit uncomfortable. What about you, Helen? If you were thinking about those four, given you have probably been on that scale, you have been in innovation teams, as well as probably been in that middle ground. When you think about proactive, challenging status quo, influence and acting first, where do you think you're sort of at your best? And then what would your work on be?
At my best is proactive and act first, which is different to yours. Like I would just be like, I'll move it forward and then sort of tell people later. I think that kind of connects to my like doerness as a vibe. I'm like, oh, I've already done this. Which is it's not really an intentional trait. It's just part of like the way that I work. I think that challenging the status quo, that restlessness to not accept how things are today. I think sometimes I just go, I'm not going to fight that. I don't think I have that like relentless restfulness. I think I'm pretty targeted on the stuff that I want to make better, and I'm willing to leave some other stuff. Whether that's right or not, I don't know, but I don't challenge everything that I think could be better. I sort of, the whole like pick your battles thing. I think I'm much more like that.
Yeah, I think I'm less like that.
Yeah, that's true. I think you spread yourself across everything you might want to change, and whereas I'll be like, I just let other things go and be like, that's the thing. I was also thinking, as you were talking there, that I think it is hard to talk about intrapreneurship without thinking about it in context. So, like for example, being an intrapreneur in an entrepreneurial company. So this is me working at Virgin. Like that's easier, right? Like that it's expected of you, and everybody who is
chosen
employed
to work
there,
at Virgin. Yeah.
You've chosen. It's easier to be an intrapreneur in an entrepreneurial company. Is just easier. It's part of the DNA. Whereas I think about when I worked at somewhere like BP, for example, that was a hierarchical organization that was very process driven. Therefore, being an entrepreneur in that organization, which I argue I did demonstrate some of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of behaviors, was exhausting. Not impossible, but it's exhausting. And so I do think it's important to think about, where are you starting from? I think you can be entrepreneurial in any organization. I just think you've got to be aware of the context, because the ease of entrepreneurship, I think, is slightly different. Not impossible, but like you might, for me, for example, when I was in BP, it helped me to find other people like me, because it made me feel like I wasn't fighting a battle on my own, and I got a lot of energy from those people. Whereas in Virgin, I think everybody was like me, and so it was more about learning how they did it a bit better, because everybody was already there. So I was like, well, how do you get influence? How did you make that happen? And so there was a wider pool of people to learn from, I think, if you're in quite an already entrepreneurial organisation.
So we're now going to move on to how to be more intrapreneurial. And as we said before, we've got some easier actions that we think everyone could just start having a go at and start practicing. And perhaps you already do some of these things really well already. And a couple of harder things, because we said I don't think this is that easy. If you're very ambitious about this, if you really want to be intrapreneurial, if that's what kind of matters to you, if you're thinking about kind of your squiggly career and you think that's a good fit for you, I think there are some harder things. So we didn't want to shy away from those things. So let's start off with an easy one though. Let's warm up with an easy one, and that is to start asking intrapreneurial questions. So these might be some of the questions that no one else is asking. These might be questions that you don't hear asked very frequently. And they are designed to do some of those things that we just talked about, to challenge the status quo, to look at things differently. So 3 examples that I came up with, just so you can hear what these might sound like. 1, what's the risk of continuing to do this in the same way? 2, what's the quickest way we could move forward to test this in practice? 3, who do we need support from to speed this up? And so you can hear in those questions, they're not super confrontational questions, but by going, what's the risk of continuing to do this in the same way? There's a connotation there that, okay, perhaps we do need to challenge ourselves to do something differently. Or in that last question, who do we need support from to speed this up? There's a sense there, this is going too slow. We're kind of not making enough progress. And so thinking about what questions could you ask where you're challenging, you're kind of being restless, you're kind of trying to move things forward, you're trying to make pacey progress on things where you can see changing this is going to kind of make a difference. It feels like this matters, and maybe for some reason it's not happening. Something's stalling or it's getting stuck, because I think these are inherently quite brave questions. Because you are being sort of challenging, then even though this is an easy action, I still don't think these are not kind of the easy everyday questions that we might be very used to asking.
And I think if asking questions feels quite intimidating, because to Sarah's point, I do think it is brave, like in the middle of a meeting to ask a question that you haven't asked before. Yeah, quick question. I mean that actually is actually a good way into it, I think. Quick question. Just before we move forward, like I've just got something I wanted to just check in on. Like those are ways into a question that can feel quite confronting. I also think maybe an easier way in sometimes is just to use more intrapreneurial language. So intrapreneurs will often talk about experiments or alternative ways, or they'll often use the word scenarios, or things that I've heard said are like, maybe we should take a challenge and build approach to this, or this is a great opportunity to test and learn. So if sometimes questions that confront the status quo might feel a bit difficult to do, then I think using some of this more intrapreneurial language could be a kind of a good way to start. And remember, this is more about getting you comfortable with the way that you're operating, and also creating that, I guess, perception from other people that you're thinking and doing things differently. So you're not going to be an intrapreneur just by asking some questions and saying some different words. But I do think it is a good place to start if you've kind of not come across this before. And we'll put those questions and some of those kind of words in the pod sheet so that you've got like a glossary to get started with, and you can start to think about how you can put them into some of your meetings.
Maybe to make this even easier, because I was like, okay, let's keep going with how do you make this, because you can't do this out of context. It would be weird, right, in the middle of a meeting to suddenly kind of throw in one of these questions.
Test and learn the monthly finances.
Yeah,
maybe
I'm not sure
you
get a super good response to that. The other thing I guess you could do is use this as a tool in your team. So as a team, you could make a commitment to say, we want to be more intrapreneurial together. And it's always easier to do these things together and with the support of people that you know well, especially if you've got a good team, everybody gets on well. You might have a list of 5 questions, perhaps ours, and then you come up with some of the ones of your own. And you just sort of every so often you agree to go, should we ask ourselves some of those intrapreneurial questions? And you're all chatting them through. And I was thinking, again, that feels not particularly daunting. Most people would feel comfortable doing that. You know the questions beforehand. And also you have signalled, this is a time where we're going to chat about some of this stuff, just to almost like together stretch this skill. We're sort of almost doing a bit of learning at the same time as a bit of practicing. Maybe that's an even easier way to start.
Yeah, and I was talking to someone called Vivi in our team. Many people will know Vivi because she creates lots of the things that you see that we share. And Vivi and I were working today on an exciting thing that's coming up in August for the podcast. And I said to her, I think these ideas, we should put them in front of the team and do a bit of a challenge and build. So again, I think just making this the way that your team works, rather than trying to change an entire organization, just trying to have an intrapreneurial team probably feels like a more realistic way to start, which leads on to the second easy action, which is about doing old things in new ways. And when we say old, we mean like routine, the things that you just don't question. We always have a meeting on a Monday morning at 9:00. We always present our monthly report in PowerPoint. This is just how we do it around here. I think intrapreneurs are good at spotting the way things that have been done for a while that are ripe for, trying something
renewal.
New out.
Yeah,
that kind of, they're just sort of like, oh gosh, because I think they probably get bored easily. They look at things and they need to kind of stay engaged, and they want to kind of test and shake things up.
You definitely get bored easily. I was just thinking, this is why you're so good at this.
Well, the trick is, I think, to make sure that your boredom can benefit others. If you're just trying to shake things up because you're bored, it's kind of a selfish way of operating. But if you can do it in a way that benefits other people, I think that's useful. So they're doing old things in new ways. The thing to sort of scan for here is what's become so routine and habitual in your team or department or organization that nobody questions it anymore. And so, the way meetings work, when meetings work, where meetings work, or, how projects are managed, all that kind of stuff. A lot of that stuff, as Sarah says, is kind of ripe for renewal. And that might just be, we'll have a no PowerPoint meeting, or we'll do meetings in the way that Jeff Bezos does at Amazon, where you get like a pre-read before you kind of get into the meeting. Or instead of everybody, using Teams or Outlook to comment on an email or an idea, we'll do it in the meeting using a tool like Miro or Mural or Jamboard. Now, I think technology is probably your friend here in terms of trying to do something different. Just back to the Vivi thing, I really like this recently. We were having some team training on AI, and Vivi and I were put in a breakout group, and we were coming up with some ideas for things that we could do differently. And we had, I think, ChatGPT-4 as like the third person in our little meeting. And so I was asking Vivi her opinion on something, and then I'd put the same question into ChatGPT-4, and it was like having a third person in the meeting. And I think other teams could do that. Like, you could invite AI into your meeting, not just to listen, like a passive AI, like lots of tools, but to almost be like an active participant in a meeting. I think that is intrapreneurial, like the extra person in the meeting that's bringing this very sort of different perspective. So old things in new ways is the area that you can sort of add just a little bit of your kind of intrapreneurial energy into a situation.
And then the final thing, the final easier action before we move on to the harder stuff, is, as Helen mentioned, try and spot other people who have intrapreneurial traits or tendencies, either in your organisation, or if you're struggling to find them inside, find people in other organisations who seem to be doing this well, because these are often people who are championing or challenging some sort of change, maybe something that they are passionate about. I was talking to one of our clients the other day, and they were giving me an example about they want to really help increase people's awareness around disability in their organisation. And she was obviously, it was obviously felt like a really brave thing for her to say that out loud, even though she was already very knowledgeable. And what she wanted to do was really connect with other change makers in other organisations, because she was very much at the start of that process for her. And so kind of her smart question was, well, who else do you know who has been a real intrapreneur on an area of interest, but where they really believe it will make a big difference to their organisation if they can do something about it? And I think just sometimes having those quite specific, you could call them, I think, in the moment mentoring conversations, because you've got a real goal in mind. You're like, okay, well, how do you manage to get stuff done? What is it that you do well? What made the difference for you? And even I was using this in a workshop the other day. There's some interesting research around, if you're talking to somebody, rather than asking for feedback, if you ask for advice, it's much, much easier for people. And I sometimes call this like the advice accelerator. So it's like, almost like to accelerate your own entrepreneurship, who could you ask for advice from? And most people are really happy to offer advice because it's really flattering to be asked. And funny enough, when Helen and I were preparing for the podcast today, that's essentially what we did. We were asking each other, we were like, well, what advice would you give somebody if they were trying to be entrepreneurial based on what you've done well? And we were both reflecting on things that have gone well, the things we perhaps would have done differently. And that definitely got us to some of the ideas, some of the actions. So perhaps just thinking about, could you have just some really short in the moment mentoring conversations specifically about this sort of intrapreneurship skill? I don't think you have to name it that. I think it's not a super common word. I don't think it's everyday language.
Yeah, I know it's not, is it? It's a funny, like, I want to be an intrapreneur. It doesn't feel like, but it's this idea that you're somebody that sort of has the ability to cut through and do something different. Yeah. The dreamers who do. I much prefer you're like, I mean, it's a funny sentence, I'm dreamer who do, but that I don't know, intrapreneurship just doesn't feel like everyday language, which means that everyone might not identify with it.
I guess probably what you can do is you'll have spotted that they will have championed either something new or probably a change, and you can say, I really admire how you've made ... happen, because they will have made something happen. Like if I think about even like knowing you when you worked in other organisations, I could like name things that you've made happen, and you could be like, I really admired how you made that happen. Like, what was it that helped you? Like, what do you think you did well? If I think about our Squiggle and Stay programme, which we've run with companies over the past year, all of the individuals from those companies who've been part of that programme are all pioneers. They have all made change happen. They are all entrepreneurs. Like, they're really good examples of people who are entrepreneurs. And I just know that any of those people would be really happy to share, like, oh, well, this is the advice I'd give to someone else if they were in a similar position. This is how I found my way through the bureaucracy, what I did when people said no, what did I do when I thought I got support and then I lost it. You know, so people who've just like lived and breathed it, I think, have an awful lot to offer.
Yeah, I think who do you admire for making something happen in or outside of your organisation is probably a really good filter for those people. Yeah. So those first three things that we talked about, so asking the question, doing old things in new ways, and spending time learning from other kind of people with entrepreneurial behaviours are kind of a really good foundation. And that might be where lots of people stop. You know, that's still, I think, helping you develop some really important skills. It's helping you make a difference to your organisation. You'll be developing lots of transferable talents. But if you do want to go a bit further with this, if this is sort of more something that you want to spend time doing, that you really want to be known for, we've got a couple of sort of harder actions that might move this to being more of your role and more of how you're spending your time at work. So the first thing, if you want to be an entrepreneur who is doing something different and making a difference to your organisation, then one of the ways that you can make that happen is by catching people's attention and by connecting them to something that is outside of yourself. So what do we mean by that? It's not enough just to say, I think that we should do this thing because I think it would be better.
Like that you saying to me, I think we should do lots of video for our podcast, Sarah. That is just a for example. So if Helen just says that, it's probably not going to happen, and we'll talk about what you might do instead.
And the reason that might not happen is I haven't really connected it to anything that Sarah cares about. So, for example, Sarah hates being on camera. So me going, I think we should just make more video. It's like, well, it's arbitrary, really. Sarah might be like, well, kind of good for you, but I kind of don't care enough about that to do something differently. But what entrepreneurs are really good at is connecting to what people care about, but also using insight that is not just about themselves. So it's not I think, it might be, so what, like, for example, I know that Sarah cares about helping people with their careers. I know that she has a value of achievement, which kind of means kind of growing over the long term for our business. And so for me, if I believed in creating more video for the podcast, what I need to do is connect to things that Sarah cares about and use kind of insight and information that is beyond just my opinion. And by doing that, I have much more influence over Sarah. And so it sounds quite complicated, but really it isn't. It's just this person that you want to say yes to this thing that you think is good to do. What do they care about, and how can you get some insight and information to influence them that isn't just about your opinion? If you can connect the insight outside of you to what they care about, you are much more likely to have influence over that individual. That's, I think, a lot of intrapreneurs get the opportunity to do things that other people don't because they connect to things that people care about in ways that other people haven't been able to do.
So let's imagine you've done that. You've caught people's attention and you've connected the dots between kind of what they care about and something that you believe is important. So I do think intrapreneurs individually do care about the change or the kind of new thing that they're trying to make happen, but they go beyond that. They also really believe, as I kind of mentioned before, this is the right thing for the goal that we've got as a team or as an organisation, or for the kind of reason that we are here. I really think this is going to help us to move forward. So if Helen was talking to me about it, it would be, you know, we've got a mission to make careers better for everyone. So then, you know, Helen would say to me, well, if we're talking about everyone, if we use video, we can double the number of people that we can reach. And I think, well, I'm very achievement focused, so that sounds good for me personally. But to be honest, even more importantly, that has a very strong fit with our mission, with why we're here. And so you start to go, okay, I've sort of gone beyond the either computer says no, or this is how we've always done things, and why do we need to do anything differently? So you're starting to nudge people into that territory of kind of influence. I then think what an intrapreneur does really well is they are, I was thinking they're a little bit like a sniffer dog, I think, or they have like a submarine sort of radar for opportunities, and they are very good at spotting the signal versus the noise. So particularly in big companies, there's loads of noise, and that noise can be the 4 million emails you get every day, or the meetings you're in, or the conversations you're having. You're probably not short of data. Most of the time you've got more than you kind of know what to do with. Depends probably a bit on where you work. But there's loads of, I always think of it as just like, there's loads of stuff. There's loads and loads of stuff. And I do see, I think Helen is very good at doing this well. Her ability to sort of absorb all of that and then sort of cut through and go, this is what matters most. That's the kind of the signal point. And it's not just, again, this is what I think matters most. It's like, no, this is sort of the gem in here. You know, this is the bit, this is kind of the diamond in the rough here. We've got all of these things that we could do, but actually, have you noticed that we've heard this word so many times? Or have we noticed that story seemed to completely change the energy in a room when we were listening to our customers, or whatever it might be? But it's just sort of spotting that signal, like having that real radar for it. And then I think these entrepreneurs are really good on, they leap on it. You know, they're like, right, I've got it. This is what it is. And then, you know, they've done it well because everyone just sort of nods. And like, this is what I always say to Helen. I was like, I've never seen anyone as do this as well as Helen. She gets people nodding very quickly. She gets me nodding, and I'm really critical. Really, well, particularly critical with Helen. And sometimes she gets me nodding, and then I'm like, I don't even know if I agree yet, but somehow I'm like nodding, and like I have to say to her, I realise you've got me nodding, and like, I just need a moment to work out if I actually believe in my nodding. And that, I'm like, that is a real skill, because entrepreneurs need to get people nodding. And that is, I think, the real thing there is going, it's the signal versus the noise. It's like spotting it, but also saying it. I think it's got to go beyond just the spot. You've got to say it, and you've got to bring it to life.
That is actually my favourite feedback I've had from you recently, was when you were like, just wait a minute, let me think about what I've just nodded at. We were in a meeting together, and I was like, oh, that's interesting feedback. So I think you can do this in a few ways. So your aim, I think, as an entrepreneur is to get people nodding along, because that's kind of validation that you're on the right track. But I also think you can notice the nods. So you don't have to be the person speaking to notice the nods. And the nods can happen in a very literal way. Like literally you're in a meeting, someone's presenting, you're not presenting, you're just observing. And you see that everyone's, you know, maybe they're doing a thumbs up on Teams. Yeah, great point, something like that. So you can sort of notice the nods from other people. I also think nods can come in the form, like if you're looking on LinkedIn, I will often look at like what are the most popular articles or what are the most commented on posts. That's a nod. It's not you've not necessarily created the content, or you've not necessarily even liked it, but you're noticing the nods. I think that's the thing. The signal versus noise is having the ability to spot what is interesting, engaging, and like a little bit unusual for other people. Those are often the things that you're going to get a lot of engagement with. Like, honestly, I remember this with Amazing If and Squiggly Careers. So this podcast that you are listening to, everybody, was not originally called the Squiggly Careers podcast. It was called the Amazing If podcast back in the day, because that's the name of our business. Wouldn't it be amazing if more people loved their jobs? But what Sarah and I both noticed was the thing that stuck from everything that we talked about when we started our business over 10 years ago was Squiggly. And so whilst what we do still has the same mission to help people in their careers and make careers better for everybody, what we noticed was that Squiggly stuck. We noticed the nods, and I think that's what intrapreneurs are really good at. So it can be in response to what you are saying, but also don't forget the role of observing and seeing what's sort of sticky and what other people might be saying or sharing as well.
And then the third hard action, and I think the hard actions sort of all follow on from each other, is intrapreneurs are very good at starting lots of small fires and then seeing which ones burn brightly and then really going hard and quite fast after those ones which are getting those nods. And so I think this looks like getting lots of fast feedback, because all of the things that you might think could change or that you might want to start, I think you have actually got to have a certain level of sort of quantity here. You have got to be starting quite a few small fires, and you have to accept that along the way, some of them, I've definitely had this, some of them I'm adamant, you're like, this is a brilliant idea, and you're getting no nods, and you're like, okay, well, it's either just not a brilliant idea, you've got to let it go as fast as it came almost, or you might want to try again in a sort of different way or kind of reframe it. But again, if you're still not getting the nod, you're like, right, let it go and move on. So I think part of this is kind of the holding your ideas lightly point. I think you've got to get very used to that. And then you've got to figure out how can you get that kind of fast feedback. So we were talking about a new idea that we've got, and we were saying what's interesting is because we've both got energy for it and we think there's something in it, we've managed to get probably fast feedback from 10 or 11 people in a week. And that's not by creating a deck or anything fancy. If anything, the opposite. I mean, I turned up to one of my friends who I'd asked for a coffee, who I really appreciate. He's kind of a real critical friend for our company. I mean, honestly, with the scrappiest bit of paper of all time. And I was like, I could barely read my own writing, but it was sort of just to remind me of the key things I wanted to talk him through. And I left him a voice note beforehand, which his feedback to me was, it was like listening to a mini podcast, because he does listen to our podcast. And so I'd done that with a few people. I was like, who are the people who I could send a really short voice note to, just to be like, what do you think of this idea? What was so interesting is when people then replay back they like the idea or they don't, and actually we got a lot of enthusiasm for this idea. There were 2 or 3 builds that people made, things that we'd not thought of or things that felt important, where I was like, right, well, this fire is only going to burn bright if we do those things. And so if those things are not right for us, then it's sort of not right to do. But I'm so glad that we've done that in like a speedy way, because then you don't waste time. You can then move into the making it happen phase much, much quicker. And I think I've got a lot more used to doing this actually probably since running a company, because I do think sometimes in big organisations there is more pressure. You feel like for some reason there just should be a PowerPoint. But I do remember one thing I worked on where I was doing some work on food waste that I probably talked about before. And I do remember having a conversation with my leader at the time. And she just went, right, we're just going to go and talk to our CEO about this, because I think this would be good. And I was like, whoa. So like, slow down. There's no PowerPoint. There's no business case. There's like nothing. And she was like, no, let's just go and see if he's free. And like nothing could make me more tense than that sort of spontaneous, let's just go and see if our CEO is free. Because you're like, well, I've not practiced. And I like to think things through. And it's very on the spot. But it was 100% the right thing to do. Because between the two of us, we could just very quickly go, well, look, I was thinking about something along these lines. Like, what do we think? Do we think this is important? Could this work? And then once you've got his interest and enthusiasm, then that's it. You're like, that's all that small fire needs to burn brightly. And then also you've sort of got as much permission as you need to then like go off and get stuff done. And so I think part of recognising what it feels like to be an intrapreneur, certainly for me, as I said, like Helen and I both experienced this in different ways, is it does feel uncomfortable. I think some moments of that process feel uncomfortable because you're either letting go of things that you thought were good, or you're having to perhaps move a bit faster than you might like. You perhaps don't get to think everything through properly, but that's what makes these people good. Like that's why they make stuff happen. So it's sort of like knowing which are the parts that might make you uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that kind of difference between sort of like maybe the ideator who comes up with ideas and the innovator who's all about sort of doing things fast, and this kind of like intrapreneur is the person that bit in the middle who's kind of coming up with the ideas and testing and kind of, you know, spotting the signals and seeing what sticks. It's that kind of ability in the middle. And I think you really do have to sort of drop the ego, because you are not the idea. I think you are sort of the momentum, you know. So actually it's your ability to take an idea and to connect with people who care about and to move it forward faster than it would have done without you. That's success. And so you have to drop the things that slow you down, or you can't succeed. You will not get momentum. And so you can't just attach yourself to an idea because you came up with it and think it's brilliant, because that's ultimately not going to be the thing that is able to move forward if you haven't connected it to the people. So just to kind of go back through a couple of things that we said there, we tried to split it into these kind of 3 easy things that are much more about behaviours that we think that everybody can demonstrate and will be beneficial to people in their squiggly careers. So this is sort of the asking the questions, using that language, sort of re-looking at things that have always been done a certain way and looking at doing it in a different way, and then spending time from learning from other people. Like, that's going to help everybody to do things differently in organisations. But if you want to go further with this entrepreneurial ability, that's where we think that catching people's attention by connecting your ideas to things they care about, sort of making sure that you can spot the signals and you're not kind of drowning in the noise that everyone else might be in, and start lots of those small fires. That's where I think this really becomes a bigger part of your role and your identity at work.
So that's everything for this week. We do hope you found that useful to flex or develop those intrapreneurship skills. We will go away and try and think of a new word for it that feels probably a bit more accessible, but also we probably can't go around saying dreamers that do either. I'm not sure that would quite get the reception that we would need in every company. So there's got to be something better. So if you can think of a better name, let us know, because the more time Helen and I have both spent talking about this and researching this, I was like, I do think there's something really interesting here, but probably the way it is framed makes it feel a bit inaccessible, potentially a bit intimidating. But the actual skills in your squiggly career, I think, will give you both profile and progress, and a lot of momentum and motivation, which I think is what we all want from our jobs. So that's everything for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and back with you again soon. Bye for now.
Bye everyone.